Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to a new episode of our Letter to Vox podcast.
And welcome to our deep dive. Today, we have a monumental mission ahead of us. We are unpacking what might be the most rigorous and foundational philosophical work of the 19th century.
We're talking about John Stuart Mill's A System of Logic, Ratiocinative, and Inductive, which he published way back in 1843.
And you really need to understand, this isn't just some dusty discussion about, syllogisms or formal logic. This work, this massive six-book framework, is the absolute intellectual bedrock for everything Mill is famous for.
Exactly. All of his most radical and, frankly, essential ideas on morality, society, governance, and, of course, freedom. It's the engine room. It dictates why he reached the revolutionary conclusions he did in his later works, like on liberty or utilitarianism.
It is the engine room. That's a perfect way to put it. So this deep dive is really about mastering the principles of evidence itself. We're going to trace how Mill built this system to make sure our beliefs are actually rationally grounded.
And then we'll look at the pretty startling implications when he applies that ironclad logic to human behavior.
Yeah. We'll discover the 5 fundamental types of facts that all propositions assert. We'll get into the detailed scientific methods he devised to prove causation.
And we're also going to have to grapple with a fascinating contradiction. Why the man who championed ultimate individual freedom also felt compelled to propose some pretty significant restrictions on voting rights.
It's a complex picture. So to understand the logic, we really have to understand the man who wrote it.
Absolutely. Because John Stuart Mill wasn't just born. He was, for all intents and purposes, engineered.
Right.
He was born in 1806, died in 1873, and became this key figure in 19th century liberalism. But his childhood, it was something else entirely.
It was a grand philosophical experiment, and a risky one, frankly. His father, James Mill, was a formidable figure in his own right, a philosophical radical, a utilitarian.
And he decided to raise his son based purely on rational input. He was basically testing the theory that you could construct a genius by just maximizing early, intense intellectual education.
And minimizing everything else.
Yeah.
Minimizing emotional development, playful distraction, all of it.
The pace of it was just brutal. I mean, Mill learned Greek at the age of 3.
3. He was reading history in the original Greek by the time most kids were, learning to add?
It's incredible. By age 10, he'd mastered Latin at a level you'd expect from a university graduate. He'd already devoured everything from Aesop's fables and Herodotus to Plato's dialogues by the time he was 7.
It was just this unrelenting regimen. By age 13, he wasn't playing sports or anything like that. He was deep into political economy, grappling with the really dense theories of Adam Smith and David Ricardo.
And he was raised almost entirely without contact with other children, just in this world of pure, unadulterated reason.
It was an intellectual marathon, and you can see the cost of that, the profound cost, when Mill hit 20 years old.
Yeah, the crisis of 1826. He talks about suffering this devastating state of dejection, describing it as a sudden, acute experience of joylessness.
A kind of intellectual burnout. He'd done it. He'd achieved every single intellectual goal his father had set for him, but he found zero happiness or fulfillment in any of it.
And this mental crisis, it wasn't just, a personal story. It was a foundational rupture in his whole philosophical outlook.
Right, because his father's brand of utilitarianism held that all useful action had to be tied to maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. Simple as that.
But here was Mill, the perfect product of that system, experiencing this profound emotional despair. He realized that the simple calculus he was raised on, that you just pursue knowledge and utility, was incomplete.
Hugely incomplete. It forced him to completely reassess pure rationalism. He came to believe that philosophy had to put emphasis on the inner culture of the individual, the development of abilities, spirit, emotion, morality.
He saw that as supremely important. It really moved utilitarianism way beyond that simple pleasure-pain calculus he got from Jeremy Bentham. This pivot is so crucial for understanding his later work.
And that focus on human development, it owes a massive debt to the second most influential person in his life, Harriet Taylor.
He met her in 1830. She was married at the time, and she became his intellectual partner, his soul friend, and his platonic beloved for years before they finally married in 1851 after her husband passed away.
The connection was just profound. Mill himself publicly acknowledged her massive influence on his later works, sometimes calling her a co-equal author. He argued she was instrumental in pushing him towards his most progressive views.
Especially on freedom and the rights of women. She was a radical left intellectual who was constantly challenging him to apply his logic to social justice.
Right. And politically, Mill was a powerhouse, a champion of social reform, a radical liberal. He was known for supporting Malthusian concepts.
The idea that population growth tends to outstrip food supply, so you need checks on it.
Exactly. And he was a pioneering early feminist. He later served as an MP for the Whigs and used that platform to fight for progressive causes. He actually introduced a motion for women's suffrage in Parliament way back in 1866.
So all of this intense background, it drove his need for a system of logic. He needed an absolutely ironclad method to defend what were, at the time, some truly revolutionary social conclusions.
Okay, so let's dive into the system itself. When Mill set out to write this definitive work, how did he define logic? How did he make it this active science of reality instead of just, mental gymnastics?
Well, he was incredibly pragmatic about it. He knew giving a perfect definition up front was almost impossible, so he gave himself a provisional one that really captures his empirical approach.
And that definition was?
Logic, fundamentally, is the science of the operations of the understanding which are subservient to the estimation of evidence.
The estimation of evidence. That changes everything, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Logic isn't just about thinking straight in a vacuum. It's about judging if our thoughts are true, if they have reliable grounding in the real world. And that's where he starts in Book 1 of Names and Propositions.
He starts with the basics, with language, even quoting Thomas Hobbes on how we use names to categorize things. But the real achievement of Book 1 is moving past the words to the underlying reality.
Right, the 5 core assertions. The idea that every meaningful statement about the world can be broken down into one of 5 things it's either affirming or denying about reality.
These are the fundamental building blocks. Let's make sure we get these clear. The first is the most basic, existence.
Simply asserting that something is. A black swan exists. Simple.
Okay. Second is order and place.
This is about spatial relationships. So the black swan is swimming directly north of the fishing dock. It defines a relative location.
Got it. Third, order and time.
The sequence of events. The black swan arrived after the sun rose. It places things chronologically.
Okay. And the fourth one is maybe the most crucial for science, causation.
Absolutely. This is asserting that one thing creates or leads to another. The cold weather caused the pond to freeze. This is the assertion that underpins almost all scientific and policy claims.
Right. And finally, number 5, resemblance.
Asserting similarity. The call of this black swan closely resembles the call of a Canadian goose. It's how we group, classify, and generalize.
So Mill basically reduces the entire universe of factual claims, from physics to poetry down to these 5 data points.
And the power of that is, if a proposition doesn't assert or deny one of these 5 things, it's either an error, a tautology, or it's just nonsense.
Exactly. So once he's analyzed what propositions are asserting in Book 1, Book 2 logically moves to the question of proof. How do we know if these assertions hold up?
Right. Book 2 is on inference, and it's all about the practical application, how the assertions are proved or disproved.
And this is where he emphasizes the art of logic, connecting it back to being a quick-witted, well-informed person.
Yes, he stresses the importance of developing a practical logical habit. He says there is no more important intellectual habit than that of discerning rapidly and surely the identity of an assertion when disguised under diversity of language.
That skill is so unbelievably relevant today with all the jargon and spin we're drowning in.
It's the ultimate intellectual shortcut. It means you can cut through the flowery language, the ambiguous terms, the conflicting jargon, and find the exact fundamental claim being made.
Is the person asserting existence, time, place, causation, or resemblance? If you can't figure that out, the argument is probably flawed or, intentionally obscure.
Okay, so we have the raw materials, the 5 matters of fact, and the need to identify them quickly. Now we get to the core of Mill's system, the engine that actually creates new knowledge.
Induction. Book 3 of Induction is, in his own words, the main question of the entire work. He says it without any reservation. What induction is and what conditions render it legitimate cannot but be deemed the main question of the science of logic, the question which includes all others.
So why does induction take center stage like that? It's a huge rejection of purely deductive systems.
Because Mill is a profound empiricist. He's absolutely convinced that the only true source of knowledge we have about the world, physical or social, is empirical observation. Seeing, testing, experiencing.
And induction is the process of generalizing from those observations to establish universal principles.
It's the only valid path if you want to move beyond just stating individual facts and actually understand how the world works, how to determine cause and effect.
And to make this process scientifically reliable, he formulated what we now call Mill's methods, 5 principles of inductive reasoning designed to systematically isolate the cause of a phenomenon.
That's right. He basically codified the scientific process. These methods are all built on one bedrock assumption: the uniformity of nature. The idea that the same causes will always produce the same effects under the same conditions.
So let's run through these methods. They're where the system of logic gets really practical. Let's start with the simplest, the method of agreement.
Okay, the method of agreement looks for similarity across wildly different cases where the same thing happens. Let's say you have a mass food poisoning incident. You look at everyone who got sick.
Okay.
One person ate seafood, another had steak, a third only ate salad. They're all different ages, they drank different things, but there's one common factor. They all ate the contaminated garnish.
So even though everything else was different, the one thing they had in common was the garnish. So the garnish is the probable cause.
Precisely. It's finding the single common thread in very diverse circumstances.
Then you have the more powerful version, the method of difference.
Yes, this is the foundation of the modern controlled experiment. It requires comparing 2 cases that are identical in every single respect, except for one factor.
Like testing a new drug. You have 2 identical groups of people. Group A gets the drug, Group B gets a placebo. All other factors are the same. If Group A recovers and Group B doesn't, the drug is the difference.
And therefore, the drug is the cause. That isolation of the single variable is what gives this method its undeniable power.
Okay, what about the joint method of agreement and difference? That sounds like it's used when a controlled experiment isn't possible.
Exactly, especially in social sciences. You combine the first 2. First, you use agreement. You find a group of cases where the thing happened and find their one common factor, let's call it X. Then you find a contrasting group where the thing didn't happen, and you confirm that factor X is missing from every single one of them. If X is the only thing present when the effect occurs and absent when it's absent, you have a really strong causal link.
Right. Now for the last 2, which deal with more complex stuff, the method of residues.
Residues is fantastic. It's for situations where you have multiple known causes operating, but the total effect you're seeing doesn't quite add up.
You subtract what you know to find out what you don't.
Exactly. If you know that parts A and B of a complex phenomenon are caused by known factors X and Y, you subtract their effects from the total. Whatever's left over the residue must be caused by some other unknown factor, Z.
That's how Neptune was discovered, right? Astronomers calculated the gravity of all the known planets on Uranus, but its orbit was still off. The leftover, unexplained pull the residue pointed to an unknown mass.
A perfect example. It's the method of solving by subtraction.
And finally, the method of concomitant variations.
This one's vital when you're dealing with things you can't just turn on and off, like temperature or economic pressure. It just states that if one phenomenon varies in any way, whenever another phenomenon varies in a corresponding way, there's a causal connection.
So if you increase the dose of a medication and the patient's symptoms consistently decrease with each increase, that variation shows a causal link.
These 5 methods basically formalized the scientific process. They gave researchers a toolkit to move beyond just correlation and establish rigorous causation. That's hugely significant.
Although we should note his philosophy of math didn't fare so well. It was heavily criticized by Gottlob Frege. But for the empirical sciences, this was a game changer.
Right. And after laying out how to find truth in Book 3, he spends Books 4 and V on, well, preparation and avoiding error. Book 4 is about the operations subsidiary to induction.
This sounds like the less glamorous but necessary groundwork for science.
It is. Mill recognized you can't just apply the methods, you have to prepare the ground. This means things like clear definitions, classification systems, proper naming conventions, all the stuff you need to do to make sure the more difficult and complicated inductive processes can even succeed.
And then Book 5 is the flip side, on fallacies, a guide to diagnosing logical failure.
A complete manual for intellectual sanitation. He identifies 5 main classes of error. First, fallacies of simple inspection, or a priori fallacies.
Assuming something is true before you even look at the evidence, just because it seems obvious.
Exactly. Then you have fallacies of observation errors from misinterpreting what you see or hear. Third, fallacies of generalization, which is just faulty induction, jumping to conclusions from too little data.
That was fourth.
Fallacies of ratiocination. These are errors in deduction, where your conclusion just doesn't logically follow from your premises. And finally, fallacies of confusion, caused by ambiguous language or shifting definitions mid-argument.
So it's a complete intellectual toolkit. Here's how to find the truth, and here are all the ways you're going to mess up trying to find it.
Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoy this podcast.
That rigorous system brings us to the ultimate goal of Mill's logic, applying it to the messiest subjects of all humanity, politics, and morality. This is Book 6, on the logic of the moral sciences.
This is the critical leap. Mill's driving belief was that the same logic you use to understand physics or chemistry must be applied to society. He argued that the backward state of the moral sciences can only be remedied by applying to them the methods of physical science.
So he believed human behavior, even with all its complexity and emotion, still followed observable, predictable laws.
And that social progress depended entirely on using induction to discover those laws. When you look at his views on the state, for example, he's a liberal but a very socially conscious one.
He was critical of the state itself, seeing it as a transitional phase.
Right, towards a truly free society without rigid power structures. And this is where he breaks from the traditional laissez-faire liberals. He grants the state an active interventionist role when it's necessary to protect the individual and the common good.
As long as it doesn't stifle individual initiative.
Exactly. He argued for state intervention to fight monopolies in things like gas, water, or railways. He supported structured poor relief, though he wanted it to encourage self-help, not dependence.
His stance on education is one of the most revealing examples. He demanded that the government compel elementary education for all children. Why was he so insistent on this mandate? It seems very unliberal on the surface.
Because for Mill, the state's long-term utility, its success, hinged entirely on the quality of its citizens. He believed only enlightened, educated people could truly progress society.
And education was the foundation for acquiring personal freedom.
Yes, and the goal was, in part, to avoid what he called the ochlocracy.
The rule of the mob.
The rule of the uneducated. He feared a society where collective short-sightedness and base self-interest dictated the laws. Without mandatory education, he thought society would fall under the sway of an ignorant majority, killing any chance for rational progress.
But here's the classic Millian twist. He demands the state ensure education happens, but he's vehemently opposed to a state monopoly on what is taught.
Yes. He feared the state taking over curricula because that would lead to enforced conformity of thought. The content and delivery had to be left to private or independent providers to ensure intellectual diversity.
And this fear of the ochlocracy, combined with his fear of the tyranny of the majority, an idea he got from Tocqueville, leads to his most controversial proposal, plural voting.
It is still so contentious, but Mill saw it as a necessary guardrail. He advocated for a multi-class voting system based explicitly on education.
So more educated citizens would get more than one vote.
Yes, them and who he called probably educated possessors, like certain professionals.
That seems like a clear violation of democratic equality. One person, one vote. How on earth did he justify that?
His justification was pure utility and quality of decision-making. He argued that the mass of a state is often a collective mediocrity, prone to acting on short-term interests.
So he believed an intellectual elite had to be empowered to guide society toward wiser, long-term decisions.
And, just as importantly, to help educate the masses toward making better choices themselves. In his mind, it was a structural solution to the problem of mob rule, a way to protect long-term wisdom from short-sighted whims.
That framework leads us right into his most famous work, On Liberty, where he lays out the environment that an enlightened individual needs to thrive. And it's all driven by what he calls the first and strongest wish.
Which is freedom. For Mill, freedom isn't a political luxury. It's the absolute, non-negotiable enabler of individual development, spiritual, moral, intellectual.
And it's all safeguarded by the cornerstone of his political thought, the harm principle. Let's define that one clearly.
The harm principle is the only condition under which society or the state is justified in restricting the action of any competent adult. He says power can only be rightfully exercised over someone against their will to prevent harm to others.
So if I'm only harming myself, making bad choices for me, society has no right to step in.
Correct. The individual is sovereign ruler over their own body and mind. Now, he does apply this strictly to competent persons, so he excludes children.
Right. And he also controversially noted that it might not apply to what he called barbarous societies, where he suggested a temporary despotism might be legitimate.
A very 19th century view, for sure. But moving from action to thought, he argues for absolute unfettered freedom of discussion and opinion. He saw that modern society, through social pressure and ostracism, could be even more oppressive than old governments.
And he gives two critical overlapping arguments for why we must never, ever suppress an opinion, even if we are sure it's false.
The first one is straightforward. The silenced view might actually be true. If we suppress an opinion, we are assuming our own infallibility, which is a massive logical error.
And he uses these powerful historical examples to make his point.
He does. Socrates, condemned for immorality. Jesus of Nazareth, crucified for his teachings. And maybe the most powerful one, the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius.
A man Mill himself called a paragon of moral integrity.
A man of incredible wisdom and virtue, who nonetheless ordered the persecution of Christians. Mill's point is, if someone as wise and good as Marcus Aurelius could be so catastrophically wrong, then we have to constantly guard against our uncertainty.
And his second argument is maybe even more challenging. Even if the unpopular opinion is demonstrably false, we still have to allow it to be debated.
Yes, because without that constant friction, without the vigorous challenge from a false position, truth turns into a dogma, a dead passive belief.
You hold it as a prejudice, but you can't actually defend it.
You forget the grounds of the belief. The debate with falsehood, he argued, leads to a deeper, better, more active understanding of the truth itself.
So freedom of opinion is paramount. But actions are different. Where does he draw the line on action?
He's very clear. No one can assert that actions should be as free as opinions. Actions have to be regulated because we live in a community.
So what kinds of acts does he forbid?
Any actions which, without just cause, inflict harm on others. This includes obvious things like inciting a mob to violence, but he extends it to social and economic duties.
Like the example of the drinking father who neglects his family.
Exactly. The drinking itself might be self-regarding, but the neglect that results from it directly harms the rights and interests of his dependents, and that justifies intervention. It's about ensuring individualism for everyone.
Okay, we need to connect all this back to his moral philosophy, utilitarianism, which was so often misunderstood.
Yeah, it got hit with the pig philosophy critique.
Right. The argument that if morality is just about pursuing pleasure, then human life is no different from an animal's life. Why strive for anything more than the contentment of a well-fed pig?
And Mill's defense of utilitarianism is just genius. He accepts the term happiness, but he totally redefines it by differentiating between qualities of pleasure, not just quantity.
He introduces a hierarchy of higher versus lower faculties.
Exactly. He argued that people with higher faculties, intellectual, moral, aesthetic potential, are actually never entirely satisfied. Their striving for perfection is a higher pleasure, even if it involves struggle and disappointment.
This leads to that famous comparison.
Right. That the simple happiness of a fool or a pig is far easier to achieve than the complex fulfillment sought by a Socrates.
An enlightened person, having experienced both, would never choose to devolve their consciousness, even if the lower life offers easier contentment.
Because the quality of intellectual pleasure far outweighs the quantity of base sensory pleasure. So true utilitarianism can only be achieved by cultivating a noble character in everyone.
And that connects right back to his demands for universal education and freedom of thought.
And it connects to his economics, too, specifically his idea of the stationary state from his principles of political economy.
This is a radical concept, especially for a liberal economist. He was critiquing the obsession with endless growth.
He called it a sickness.
Yeah.
He argued that once a society had achieved enough wealth for everyone, once poverty was eliminated, it should enter a stationary state.
Which sounds like stagnation. What did he mean by that?
Well, his definition is very precise. The stagnation applies only to capital and population growth. It does not mean the end of human advancement.
So it's a redirection of energy.
A total redirection. In this state, intellectual, cultural, and scientific progress would continue, even intensify. The ideal outcome is a society where no one is poor, no one wishes to be richer, and no one has reason to fear that he will be pushed back by the efforts of others.
The very nature of work would change.
Fundamentally, labor hours would be shortened dramatically. Industrial improvements would no longer just serve to create more wealth, but to reduce the effort of work, freeing up human time and energy for higher pursuits: art, philosophy, science. It's a vision of a post-materialistic ideal.
So his whole system leaves this really complicated but incredibly powerful legacy.
It does. On the social front, his radical feminism is still groundbreaking. He publicly credited Harriet Taylor's influence on the subjection of women, where he made an egalitarian argument that was centuries ahead of its time.
He just dismissed any inherent differences between men and women as products of society and education, not nature.
His core argument was that inequality itself breeds selfishness and distorts character. He believed an egalitarian social structure would benefit everyone by elevating the moral character of the whole society.
And that conviction fueled his political action, pushing for women's suffrage and divorce rights in Parliament.
But his political balancing act, well, it earned him criticism from both sides of the spectrum. Let's look at the Marxist reception.
Karl Marx, in Das Kapital, called Mill, what was the phrase, a geistlosen Syncretismus.
Which is roughly spiritless syncretism.
What did Marx mean by that? It sounds harsh.
He meant that Mill was trying to reconcile things that were fundamentally irreconcilable. He was trying to harmonize the interests of capital owners and workers, which Marx saw as a futile effort to protect private property while trying to patch up its worst effects.
So Mill saw the inequality but didn't demand a radical restructuring.
Right. Marx saw it as a spineless compromise. But then on the other side, you have the 20th century liberal economist Friedrich August von Hayek.
And Hayek had a complex relationship with Mill's thought.
He praised Mill a lot, cited him in The Road to Serfdom, but he also accused Mill of steering liberalism towards socialism by granting the state these active roles in the economy and society.
So he was claimed by progressive liberals and accused by market liberals of abandoning the pure path.
It says a lot about the intellectual honesty of his thought that he managed to both inspire and offend people across the entire political spectrum.
Okay, let's consolidate this deep dive with the essential takeaways from John Stuart Mill's vision.
All right. First, Mill's system starts with an empirical root. Logic is the science of estimating evidence, proven through observation and the systematic methodology of induction. This applies to physics and human behavior alike.
Socially, he argued that progress has to be guarded by the harm principle. The state or society can only intervene in individual liberty to prevent clear, tangible harm to others. You have absolute sovereignty over your own body and mind.
Morally, he redefined utilitarianism. True happiness isn't base pleasure. It's intellectual and moral development, the higher quality pleasures, which require education and freedom.
And economically, he rejected the obsession with endless growth, advocating for a stationary state focused on cultural and intellectual progress, reduced labor, and a higher quality of life, not just the ceaseless accumulation of capital.
And at his core, Mill was a radical liberal who saw that the biggest long-term threat to individual development often came not from the state, but from the social tyranny of majority conformity, the collective mediocrity of the uneducated.
Mill passionately warned that suppressing false opinions turns accepted truth to a dogma, a dead ritual we can't defend. But if we fast forward to our current digital age, this raises a provocative question for you to consider.
Mill argued the act of silencing an opinion is a societal harm. But if society is now flooded with digital misinformation designed to destabilize reality itself, does the sheer volume of destructive false opinions become a harm that justifies intervention?
Or must we stick rigidly to Mill's defense of constant open debate? You should ponder how we estimate evidence in an age of infinite anonymous digital assertions.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into John Stuart Mill's logic and his vision for an enlightened society. We encourage you to explore his ideas on the stationary state and the critical arguments on liberty for yourself.
We'll catch you next time for another session of intellectual enlightenment.